Okay, I'm just going to wait about 15 seconds to give people a chance to join the broadcast. Okay, so why don't we get started? I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our webinar. What I'm going to do is start out with just a little bit of logistics. Then we'll go around and do some introductions and then get going on the content. So first of all, I want to point out that the webinar is being recorded and it's going to be available on demand afterwards. So if you have to leave or if you'd like to share this webinar with some people who aren't here, you can always do that after the fact. It's also the case that there are going to be some documents attached to our Synaptiq Bright Talk channel. So one is an ebook on AI and healthcare. There's also a place for you to send project ideas. So at Synaptiq, we do data science, machine learning, and AI consulting. So if this sparks any ideas, please reach out to us using that form. You'll notice in the user interface that should be a little question mark off to the right. So the audience can ask questions at any time. We're going to try and save the Q&A for the last 10 minutes of the panel. So feel free to drop questions in there and we'll try and review those at the end and answer as many as we can. So again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this panel discussion about the future of AI and healthcare diagnostics. So my name is Tim Oates. I am a professor in the computer science and electrical engineering department at the University of Merrill in Baltimore County. I got a PhD in computer science from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I spent a year as a postdoc at MIT in the AI lab before I came to UMBC, and I've been there ever since working as a professor. I'm also the co-founder of Synaptiq. We're a full-stack AI consulting firm that served over 40 clients in a diverse set of industries. And I'm very happy here to be here to moderate this panel with life sciences experts. I'm actually really looking forward to what's going on. And you know I'm taking it seriously because this is the first time I've worn a collared shirt in about 2 months. But before we get into the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce the panelists. The first is John Alderete. He's the founder and president of Folium BioMed, LLC, which is an investment and product development and evaluation company. John has really deep life sciences experience as well as experience with medical devices, diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics, with an emphasis in infectious diseases and oncology. He has a PhD from the University of Washington in conjunction with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center and an MBA from the University of Texas. We also have Brad Schmidt, who is the CEO of Panaxium, which is a company that with teams in France and Canada. It's one of a new generation of bioelectronic medicine companies pioneering the use of implants to treat neurological dysfunctions. His doctoral research at Cornell was in electrical engineering and microsystems for life sciences application, and he's been a part of several technology startups. Previously, he was a management consultant with McKinsey & Company and advises several small companies and is in the med tech and materials fields. And then, last but not least, we have Jonathan Merril, who's the CEO of epitopeRX, which is a life science company that's working to revolutionize the design, testing, and production of vaccines. epitopeRX makes use of big data analytics to rapidly design and evaluate vaccines, very important topic these days. He has experience in machine learning as applied to the life sciences, and he's a serial entrepreneur who has started and managed several companies directed to commercializing healthcare technology, all of which, including a very recent one, has resulted in acquisition or merger into public or private entities. And he is the lone medical doctor. He got his medical doctorate from the George Washington University School of Medicine. So that's the panel. I just want to say a few words to kind of, sort of set the stage for things, and then I'm going to let the panelists do 95% of the talking. So the sort of theme of this panel is that we believe artificial intelligence is going to play a prominent role in the future of healthcare, and the question is why? So to be effective, healthcare providers need to access accurate and timely information as well as effective treatments, but also, really importantly, they need time with patients. And unfortunately, the time that they need has become an increasingly rare commodity for doctors in recent decades. So rehumanizing healthcare, perhaps counterintuitively, might rely on a technology, artificial intelligence, that many people think is going to replace human workers. So today's medicine is data rich. It relies heavily on knowledge workers, and knowledge workers are highly educated and specialized medical professionals to deliver optimal results. So we believe that AI can help bring personalization and highly effective healthcare programs administered by doctors who can go back to the business of patient care, of talking to you and me. So in essence, AI is going to be used to fill gaps that humans can fill, but just don't have the time to, leaving the humans to do the sort of face-to-face interaction. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to focus on how AI can be applied to the area of diagnostics and treatment. And as you can see, we've got some very diverse opinions on the panel. The panelists are discuss some of the ways they've been working in this space, how and what has changed as a result of COVID-19, and what they are hopeful to achieve given their expertise. So that's kind of the groundwork. So now what I'd like to do is to give the panelists a chance to speak. And we've got two Johns. I'm going to refer to one of you as Jonathan and the other as John, and you know who you are, just to kind of help me keep it separate. So to help the audience get a better understanding of each of your backgrounds and interest in the topic, we're going to start with a simple question, which is, what inspired you to join this panel? Can we start with John on that one?
Sure. Well, we're clearly at an age where diagnostics and technology have been shown to be important and powerful tools to help mitigate global health issues. It's very timely to have these discussions as we build out systems and technologies, as you articulated. And given my background in diagnostics development, I hope to be able to contribute to these discussions.
Okay, thanks. Brad, how about you?
Yeah, for me, it's never been clear that AI is going to be an integral part of healthcare, and that there is this real convergence going on between among the devices, and that's what we're developing, Panaxium, specifically for treating neurological injuries and disorders, and things like the imaging, and the automation that's coming from robotics and use of that in procedures. And then the intelligence, all of which the analysis that the AI is a big part. And then all of that is going to be more reliant on better diagnostics, better intelligence over the lifetime of a condition versus just kind of like these snapshots that we do today. And I think that's no surprise. So what is notable is that it's happening faster than it takes to develop a product in our space, faster than it takes to develop the protocols and the plans for the clinical trials that are underway. And so we have to build in more flexibility and consideration of that right into our plan from the get-go.
Okay, so but now, it sounds like now you're a believer that AI is going to be a part of healthcare. You said that what?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good. All right, Jonathan?
I think that it's exciting right now to be alive in the world, both from an ML perspective and the possibilities of what computers bring to the table in analytics. But the biggest thing in terms of the panel that's exciting to me today is that a lot of biological systems are very hard to understand, and people are basically just holding up one set of data, looking at it and say, okay, this is my decision, and then another round of data and looking at that. And particularly everybody's becoming a virologist right now with COVID. But the reality is we have all these systems in our body that are fighting the virus, and we're not sure exactly how they interact. So I'm hopeful from this panel in just getting different opinions and ways of looking at problems, and those can be applied toward some of the things that we've been thinking about. And it's just an exciting thing to have ML, where you can really take this versatile tool and apply it to all sorts of different issues. So I'm excited to be here today.
Okay, great, awesome. So for the next question, it's sort of a two-part thing. One is kind of at a big picture level, what are the biggest challenges in diagnostics and treatment today? And to the extent that you have some thoughts on it, and Jonathan, you were just touching on this, has the pandemic highlighted any of these in surprising ways? So biggest challenges in diagnostic and treatments, and how has COVID impacted that in an interesting way? How about John? Can we start with you this time?
Sure, and I'm going to focus on diagnostics here, since that is an area of interest for us. And one of the biggest challenges, at least as we see it, includes the ability to quickly obtain results and convey them to the appropriate decision makers. And the importance, at least in my eyes, of this has been demonstrated during this pandemic, where initial diagnostic turnaround times for COVID-19 diagnoses were anywhere between 24 hours and 5 days initially. So time to results is one. And following this is, how do we convey these results to decision and policymakers and clinicians so that appropriate and real-time information can be used to guide policy or treatment for better outcomes. For example, are these results analog on paper? Are they transcribed into systems that may or may not talk to other systems? and so on. Secondly, in developing diagnostics, even within the less complex and simple spectrum of devices, still takes time and is costly. And there are a lot of performance and regulatory concerns that have typically been commercialization barriers to smaller development groups. And the result that is needed, the result is that needed technologies take a long time to get to market or not developed at all, as the market, it seems to be defined by larger companies and their focus on their shareholders or invested technology platforms that may not be appropriate for the situation. And finally, you can see that the whole world has gone through these histrionics to try and develop rapid tests or diagnostic tests in general for COVID-19 virus. And this pandemic really has laid bare the need for a more efficient development and regulatory pathway. And in reality, our global health truly does depend on this.
Okay, great, thank you. How about Jonathan? Do you want to go next?
Sure. So my most recent venture has been looking at developing a vaccine for COVID. And I think, I went to med school now, an embarrassing number of years ago, and studied immunology. And the reality is that even we fast forward to today, the tests that are done to look at how to protect ourselves against COVID are still very stovepiped. And we really don't have a comprehensive understanding of how the immune system works. I mean, those of us who are just reading the newspapers read about antibodies. Obviously, they're used in tests. They have some protective mechanisms in some cases. And then we have the innate immune system, which is cellular immunity, where the cells can actually attack the viruses and so forth. And the challenge is, and just getting a little bit into the granularity, because I think it's important when we talk about ML and so forth, is that these different worlds never really see eye to eye. You have a lot of people that are studying antibodies, and a lot of people are studying cellular. How do you figure out if a vaccine is going to be effective? We all have when we look at the four squares, we all have slightly different genomes in our bodies. We're going to respond differently from that, plus some environmental factors. And we really have a hard time figuring these things out. So to put a little bit of a point to this argument, if you will, for the use of ML, and ML is really powerful in being able to detect signals, making correlations, predictive analytics, and we really don't have any of that, in vaccines right now. So the exciting thing is you need data, right? For ML, it doesn't matter how powerful your computer is. If you don't have curated data, you can't really do anything with it. So we do have the human genome. Compare the two. So just one last little point is what we're looking at in a broad sketch when we're looking at ML is making sure that the pathogens, because some of the pathogens, whether they're cancer or virus, have sequences in them that are homologous to humans. So if we make our vaccine with those things, we might have an autoimmunity, or we might not actually react to the vaccine. So there's some really neat things that we can do with the data to design vaccines that have really never been done historically until the very, very recent past. So, and some of these things are lost in the race, to a vaccine. Some of these things are overlooked. And it's important for the community to know what's possible.
Okay, awesome, good. Brad, how about you?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big challenges for us is just this increased complexity in the information that we're receiving. We're looking at treating very kind of long-lasting injuries or chronic conditions, and how these conditions evolve over the long term are not obvious in these simple snapshots. And they have to integrate a lot of supplemental information. When you already, and we rely a lot on imaging data, things like DT-MRI, functional MRI. When you already have a time-varying DT-MRI that's already introducing a dozen variables to consider and upwards, you just can't see it. The clinician just can't view it from all the right angles, and you really need some type of assistance. I think a problem that's already existed for us is that there's really not a lot of baseline data. People rarely collect data of their own healthy brain. It's only when something goes wrong you actually take these images. And this has actually been made apparently clear by the current pandemic crisis, because you actually have to kind of fill in, something suddenly happens, and you have to fill in what's happened in the past. And so the type of data augmentation techniques for kind of like really enabling us to look back and kind of piece together what things may have looked like so that we can make some decisions about how things look now is becoming really very important to us, and I think it's just been highlighted by the COVID-19 situation.
Right. Okay. All right. Awesome. Thanks. So each of you described some challenges. So the next question is, if AI is going to help solve or address some of these challenges, how do you see that working? And then, what are you particularly excited about, and how do you see that impacting the world of health and patient wellness? And, again, I think you touched on some of this. Each of you touched on a little bit in your responses, but if you could augment that, sort of specifically the role of AI, that would be great. So in my role as moderator, I think I've already messed up the ordering. So now let's go to Jonathan first, because I don't think I've gone to you first yet.
Okay, thank you. Well, in terms of the role of AI in healthcare in general, I mean, obviously, we need data, or ML. We need a lot of data, and we have a lot of data now with the sequencing of the human genome, the ability to sequence pathogens, and then also comparison of things. But I think the data that we need in addition, which in a number of the other presenters have pointed to, is physiologic data. What happens dynamically? And that's harder to obtain. It's easier to obtain fixed data, like what's in your genome. But how does your body, how do the individual systems interact, with an infection? Those are harder things to figure out. So I'm excited about the prospect of both ML and also figuring out what models work. For example, I've been reading a lot about zebrafish. I don't know how many people on the panel have heard of zebrafish. Raise your hands. So zebrafish are, when you think about experimental models, we live a long time. We can't expose ourselves to deadly pathogens or potentially harmful pathogens on a routine basis, but we need animal models that have short lifespans where we can test these things. And some of them are going to be more or less similar to humans. But the whole thing with ML is it might not be that similar, but if there's a signal there that correlates or is predictive, then we have the ability to impact healthcare. So the zebrafish is a very small little fish, can be put in a petri dish. You can do all sorts of analytics. It has a primitive immune system. It has all sorts of systems that are in some ways similar to us. And the big question for ML is, are they similar enough to be able to get predictive tests? And then if you can't get predictive tests from that, can you look at systems that are existent and do studies where you can get data from it? So it's the old adage of garbage in, garbage out, but on a massive scale. What data can we use that will impact our healthcare? And that's the big question. And I'll just bridge to one thing that I've been learning about recently, and that's cancer. And it turns out that with a cancer cell, one of the tricks is that it's the whole thing of self versus non-self. They have neoantigens that kind of sprout up on the cancer cell that are different. So the problem with cancer is that if these neoantigens kind of cloak themselves with antigens that are the same as what we find in our body doesn't fight them. So the big challenge, both for our bodies, they're sort of like ML systems in and of themselves, constantly looking at proteins, which ones are self versus non-self, is we have to remember that our biological systems have incredible complexity in ways of dealing with information. We're kind of coming in, a lot later, billions of years later, and trying to apply the same types of technology that our bodies are doing today on a different scale, looking at different organisms, looking at how our bodies are responding to cancer, to pathogens. So I think that there's a lot of biological inspiration for ML that we'll see in the coming decade.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's a long history of biological inspiration in machine learning in general, but I think you're talking about a different kind, right? Looking at the mechanisms that are used by biology inside the body to fight some of these pathogens.
Yeah, immunity.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, how about Brad? Let's go to you next on the role of AI and what's particularly exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it potentially can unlock for us in our space around neurological diseases and neurophysiology is this getting away from this old habit of describing diseases based on exclusively by their symptoms, right? And we often describe cases of dementia or depression or addiction or compulsive disorders. But really, if we have the ability to really understand the biomarkers better and really understand the imaging data better, then we can start categorizing things really on their physiological dysfunction and describe something, because each of these diseases looks different in the individual patient, and that dramatically affects their ability to respond to a particular treatment protocol. And so if you can really start describing these into kind of what's going on inside of the brain instead of what we see on the outside, then our success rate in choosing a treatment and the options we have go way up. And I think that that's really inspiring for us and what the vision we see of the future, where you go in and kind of describe some symptoms and say, well, the first thing we do is image you, not the last thing. But behind that really needs to be like this assistance to interpret all of that complex biomarkers. And we're getting there. We're seeing a huge amount of progress in this area. But that's really, what we see is just around the corner, and very excited to show up very shortly.
Okay, so you're, just to follow up on that, it sounds like what you're suggesting is it's not just a sort of a change in the way you talk about things, but it's almost a change in the way you categorize things, that you're looking at, I'm going to describe your disease by the underlying dysfunction, and that's going to allow the medical professionals to treat it more effectively.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
We have a better really being able to describe things as the physiological problem in the body, and not about like just the kind of surface symptoms. And I think that applies to a lot of areas, but it's very kind of like specifically kind of has been really complex in neurophysiology, but I think it really broadly applies to all kinds of different diagnostics.
Right. Well, it's like when I go to the mechanic and I say my car's making this noise, and he goes, "Oh, well, it's because this belt is loose." Right. It's just a very different way of viewing it. Okay. So, John, how about you?
Well, I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way, from a more of an investor's standpoint. In 2019, there was approximately $2 billion invested in AI in the healthcare space, and so far as I understand it, about 700 million to date in the AI space. And of course, there is a lot of interest in how in the AI space in hopes of impacting clinical outcomes in healthcare. Yet, interestingly, from my perspective, AI continues to mostly be relegated to the area of hospital systems, which is historically where it's been. And undoubtedly, this pandemic has opened up new areas of interest in AI, among other areas, for bettering clinical outcomes for patients. As an example that I can come up with off the top of my head is using AI to help diagnose pneumonia or presumed COVID cases, right, from digitized lung x-rays, which seems pretty straightforward and useful. But it's also being used for some areas that are questionable. For example, like reviewing patient healthcare records to predict which coronavirus patients may become more critically ill than others. And this is only questionable because the technology has not been validated prior to being commercially deployed, right? And so that seems to be an interesting area that we're in right now. And as you've already heard from both Drs. Merrill and Schmidt, AI clearly does have the capacity to parse large volumes of information and see patterns and data that we simply cannot as humans. But in order for these kinds of analyses to be useful to decision makers, we have to figure out what kinds of information is going to be most helpful for us. And right now it seems to be a scattershot of interests. And I think we'll talk about this later in our own individual efforts, but we're really focused on one very narrow area in helping patient outcomes. And I think we'll talk about this later, but that's what I'm excited about, is groups like ours and on the panel here who are focusing on areas that will help build stories around AI and its usefulness in healthcare.
Okay, that's good. I mean, that's the second time I think you've mentioned how do you communicate the results out. So it would be interesting to hear more about that. I mean, I know I get lots of information from lots of different places, and it's very hard for me as a layperson to sort out what of it is real, particularly around COVID. So John, why don't we stick with you? And so can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing at Folium BioMed?
Sure.
And, just talk about, how AI can be applied there, how it's being applied in your setting.
So you did a fantastic job of introducing me and Folium. Thank you for that. Just as a reminder, Folium is a sort of a holding company of sorts. It's a vertically integrated operational group that finds different technologies, and we invest in different technologies in medtech, diagnostics, and drug discovery in areas that we feel are where there's clinical unmet need. And we have several ongoing projects, all within the infectious disease space. But the projects that currently command our full attention at the moment, and not surprising, are a couple of diagnostic technologies related to the detection and screening of SARS-CoV-2. from infected individuals. And while I can't speak to the specifics of our technology platforms, I can say that one of the areas that we're really interested in on the Folium side is using technology to augment the efficacy of these diagnostic platforms. How can we use technology to, one, help or eliminate human error, reduce or eliminate human error? And for us, part of the answer is to provide diagnostic platforms with integrated technologies that remove human subjectivity from data interpretation altogether. And we as humans have a knack in taking platforms that work quite well and finding ways to introduce problems. As an example of this, where I live, we had a diagnostic test for a COVID-19 patient that was performed accurately, but a lab technician misinterpreted the data and the disease outcome was misattributed. Well, this is a problem, and this probably happens more often than we'd like to admit. And you've heard me say this again already. How do we convey this information in real time to people who need to know? During one of the more recent Ebola outbreaks, there was a new technology deployed, which was a rugged tablet that was designed specifically for Ebola clinical data collection that was able to convey diagnostic and clinical data directly to the World Health Organization and other national health leaders. And this, of course, was all designed to mitigate the virus spread. But in this case, clinical data was still collected manually, written on paper first, and needed to be transcribed to this tablet, again, introducing potential error. And I believe this is the case, but the data was uploaded periodically, in this case, I think every 24 hours. So critical clinical information was still being provided and as a bolus of information between long intervals. And while this is a step in the right direction, it's still not ideal, particularly for viruses. So we intend to design our diagnostic technologies to perform within certain specifications. In other words, I'm making the assumption that the technology works. That's not the issue. And we're interested in addressing the inefficiencies of the diagnostic process that are independent of this platform. So the potential for human error, the lag in conveying information, and this pandemic for us has demonstrated the very real need for almost real-time monitoring of certain clinical events as they unfold. 24 hours, 5 days to clinical result is just not acceptable, particularly now. So this is an area we're deeply interested in with our projects, and we're really looking for the opportunity using technology to have a conversation with the patient, the clinician, and health policymakers all together, basically in real time. And I think that AI definitely has a contemporary place in this equation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I have a PhD student who did some work in Tanzania with rapid diagnostic tests, and his PhD thesis was inspired by that because it was exactly that problem, that people are writing down results of tests on pieces of paper and then having to transcribe that into electronic form so that it could be uploaded. And that problem is very hard also just because of infrastructure issues, right? So power can come in and out and things like that. So yeah, bringing technology to bear on that seems like it's hugely important. Okay, thank you. So Brad, let's shift gears to you. I know that you have an interest in neurological diseases, and I understand that they're still a leading cause of death globally. So a couple of things I'm wondering, how has the sudden shift of attention to infectious diseases impacted the work that you're doing, if at all? Can you talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing and how that relates to AI and machine learning in particular?
Sure. So, I mean, the answer is that part of it has shifted, but for the most part, it really hasn't, because neurological disorders remains this very fast growing area, really outside of this current crisis, the fastest growing category of kind of diminished quality of life and cause of death. It's 1 in 8 is now dying of dementia-related diseases. 800,000 people in the U.S. are having strokes every year, and a large number of them have a significant lasting effects from those. And so it really hasn't for the most part. We're just kind of trudging along, working on our devices and our treatment approaches. But on the other side, we've seen that one of the observed complications we've seen in COVID has been related to kind of high risks of stroke and blood clotting, and those things obviously have effects. And also, just even during the treatment, talk to colleagues at other companies who are focused on the fact that in order to treat these patients on ventilators, many of them are being very heavily sedated. and the ability to like actually know what's going on in kind of neurological, their neurological function, and monitor that has an impact on, you know, how many drugs you're using, and how many you know, is it really, can you be doing too much? Can you predict whether they're going to run into a problem during the night when they're not being watched as closely? And so all of that is actually, as a field as in general, you're seeing more and more kind of like attention on this, because the complexity of this particular virus on the body is raising all kinds of these issues. And I think there's going to be a lot of kind of like long-term questions that are going to be required to be answered, that are going to depend on kind of like the ability to kind of monitor neurological function. For us, we're focused mostly on kind of like longer-term chronic conditions that, based on really, imagine closed feedback and electrophysiological measurements in the brain that are then translated into stimulation treatments to either kind of bypass or improve plasticity and connectivity in the brain. So for us, you know, that's just a kind of a broad category of applicable kind of treatment for various neurological disorders. And, you know, our eye is still on that mainly. Where artificial intelligence comes into this is really the, you know, to date, neurostimulation has often been driven by, you know, almost like a pacemaker, where things are kind of stimulated on a regular kind of like protocol that's determined by the clinician adjusting a few conditions in the clinic and sending somebody home. And the ability to actually kind of respond to changes in the brain and change the kind of therapeutic stimulation accordingly depends on, you know, actually figuring out what in that individual patient, what information matters, what is their like specific biomarker. And that's really where artificial intelligence is going to play a role in our specific kind of approach to treatments. Okay.
So can I just ask a couple of quick follow-up questions? One is, why are neurological disorders becoming increasingly common? Is there, you know, a sort of a community thought about why that is?
Well, part of it is just that we're getting better at solving other problems, right? So as patients get older, we're just running into these things where maybe we didn't run into them before. So as you know, as we extend lifetimes, we're actually seeing more of these creeping up, because things like oncology and cardiac conditions are being better treated, and so we're running into these, and then this is like kind of the next thing on the list.
Okay. And then the second question is, when you're talking about, I think you use the term closed loop, right? So I'm assuming then what your company is doing is you are sensing, you're getting some measure of quality or goodness, or sort of how well the patient is doing, and then you're trying to adjust dynamically to maximize that through time. Is that what you mean?
Yes, and really this is, I mean, you think about it, there's been a lot of kind of press over the past while around like kind of brain-machine interfaces and the ability to like, you know, control a prosthetic from the brain. And there's a lot of like information you can analyze, and it's been demonstrated over and over again that by applying things like machine learning, you can reduce the need for the amount of data points that you need to collect in those situations. Really, the number of kind of electrical you need inside the brain. Think of it as, we're not focused on prosthetics and being able to control something inside of the body. We're actually looking at it as a way to turn around and help repair something that's some other point inside the brain.
I see. And so the machine learning is being used to help make that minimally invasive in one aspect of it.
Yeah, to limit the and part of it's just to like, so that to build in redundancy and to be able to really not rely on a very specific kind of like you know, predetermination by the clinician before they go in there, be able to place the device and then turn it on and let that signal come to you, versus trying to put it in a position where you're looking for some specific signal from specific track in the brain. And that's like a very like, you know, difficult thing to do, where if you can actually just kind of like record the signal and start looking at it, you can you know, you don't have to be so specific in where you place it. And then, but it's also important to realize that like no single neuron lives forever. And so it's very easy to imagine that like think of it as channels of signal dropping as you continue. You can't rely on any one thing either, and so you have to have the ability to adapt. I think that's a critical point to this. It's not just how you set it up, but as it evolves over time, the ability to kind of like find a new biomarker, a new response that you can rely on, so that if things change or get out of whack, you can still continue the treatment.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. Yeah, that was very clear. Okay. So now let's go over to Jonathan. You got a bunch of doctors on this call, but only one medical doctor, and that would be you. So it would be interesting to get your perspective on how we can use AI to understand immunity, which, I mean, I think you said very well early on, is just a big, complicated system that we don't have a good handle on. And there's a statistic I saw that there are over 120 vaccines in development, and so can machine learning help predict efficacy? Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah, there's actually more than 200 vaccines that are in development. A lot of them focus on the spike protein. And the challenge is that the spike protein has sequences that are homologous, or the same as humans. So the challenge is if you inject almost a Trojan horse into the body that has the same sequences that you find in the body might say, oh, this, it has the same sequences. This is fine. Let's take it in. And all of a sudden you have a much worse reaction. So those are called adverse reactions that can be caused by vaccines. And I'm not saying that that's true for every vaccine that uses that protein, but the point being is that machine learning, with the ability to look at all these different sequences and compare the human genome, the sequences found in the pathogens, is a huge step from back in the day where you'd scrape a cowpox with Jenner and take that material and inject in someone and get a vaccine. Now we have the capability of really doing designer vaccines. Like many of us have heard of the expression personalized medicine, with the promise of being able to create individual medicines that are specific for the situation that a patient finds themselves in, whether it be their specific genome or specific condition and the rest of it. So I think that the most exciting thing with immunity is that, as I mentioned before, historically, there are two things that you look at with machine learning. One is the pathogen itself, doing the analytics around the pathogen. So I'll just call out some of the things that a lot of people haven't heard about. So coronavirus, having a virus that has essentially a crown around it, that's where it comes from. There's a bunch of viruses that are in that family. How do you build a vaccine against that, the particular one, the COVID-19 as it's referred to in the press? Well, the reality is that this is an RNA single-stranded virus. It's prone to mutation. What you want to do is look at the entire family and figure out what sequences are conserved. What are the most similar things? So when you build the vaccine, hopefully it'll be effective if there's minor modifications in the strain. So that's one area that machine learning can help us, is to look at the sequences, compare them, and figure out what sequences are conserved and which ones aren't found in the human genome. So that's one piece. The other piece, the other big bucket is, and I alluded to this before, is understanding the immune system. We really don't have an ML model of how to anticipate how a vaccine will work. In the pharmaceutical industry, small molecule discovery, the Advils, all those things that are being given, there's a great amount of data, and ML is being used by all the major pharmas to figure out what drugs have been approved that might be used for a different condition and so forth. But for vaccines, there's no such luck because the systems are much more complex. So, looking at the crystal ball of ML with more and more sophistication, better algorithms and so forth, it's going to be divining how these systems interact. And I mentioned again, humoral immunity, where you have antibodies, you have cellular immunity, how these systems interact. You might have heard of cytokines that are released and cause a worse situation with people with COVID. How do all these systems interact? So you could build a computer model and say, okay, in my simulation, here's a new vaccine candidate. How will it work? Because it's very, very primitive right now how we test vaccines. We do things like virus neutralization studies to see if putting sera on a plate of cells can protect it when it's exposed to COVID. And that's for the antibodies. Then for the T cells, you remove some T cells from convalescent serum or serum that that is exposed to the virus. How do those T cells react? Those are two very different studies. How do you figure out if this one's great and this one's not as good, if that's a good vaccine, if you're looking at thousands of candidates? So I just wanted to paint a picture so people can understand how far away we are from being able to use ML effectively. But the exciting thing is, with the advent of ML and larger data sets that are sort of the silver lining of COVID, is being able to build better tools, both to understand how to treat COVID, and these same things will translate into cancer. It's a very similar problem, and vice versa. In fact, recently there was a T-cell treatment that was used by a major cancer center, and it's being used, flipped around to be used for COVID. So that's the exciting thing about this panel, is you take cross-disciplinary use of ML, and sometimes it can cross-pollinate, and you can figure out solutions to these broad problems.
Okay, so just one quick follow-up question is so you said we still have a lot to sort of work to do to get to the point where we have a useful model of the human immune system. Is that mostly sort of first principles, still trying to figure out the functioning and the various components of it, or is it more of a data issue? That is, if you had enough data that you'd be able to make progress rapidly? No, I think Jonathan might have frozen. Yep. I'll tell you what, we'll see if we can get him when we come back. So hopefully Jonathan will come back. All right, so why don't we move on? We're actually kind of getting near the end. So let's talk about COVID. And actually, we were just touching on that. There's been a lot of talk in the media that the disease has accelerated the option of new technology. And, I actually see this a lot. Everybody I know who's doing data science these days, there are all these data sets out there. There are lots of individuals and companies that are jumping on it, trying to make an impact. And, so the question is, do you think that's true? I mean, do you really think it's the case that COVID is driving adoption of AI and machine learning technologies in a meaningful way? And, why or why not? How about we start with Brad?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think generally in terms of technology, not being specific to AI, I think it's absolutely true. I see this because, we've seen examples where companies are getting emergency clearance to use their technology. So the things that were being set up for clinical trials are now being, being used quickly and rapidly, and spreading by reputation among different hospitals in a good way. So I think we're also seeing just that everyone's in problem-solving mode. So the clinicians who are on the front lines are trying to figure out solutions. So where they may have been kind of like burdened and thinking about kind of other issues in their practice, right now they're like, as they're facing this, they are trying to, they're open to any solution that they can find. And so people who are out there as technologists presenting them are at least getting a look at it where they may not have previously. So in terms of AI, I think a part of it is that like that's along for that ride in general. But it really depends to your point around kind of like what data sets are becoming available and what people can like pick at, and I see a huge variation in like kind of what's good data and what's not in order to kind of to work with.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of people trying, but I think that it really depends on what how the data is ready for it, because at the same time people are kind of rushing, and it's not necessarily being captured in the way that's usable on the same kind of time scales as what everybody wants.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, a lot of what I see, like I said, is individual researchers who are going and grabbing data sets and building models. And it strikes me that, your average independent computer scientist is not well equipped to understand, clinical relevance of what they're doing, for example, because that's a very long process of trying to establish that. So this sort of need for, there's this desire to give me data and get results versus let me make sure that the thing I'm doing is safe and effective. Those are kind of pulling in different directions. Yeah. Okay. Hey, welcome back. Hey, John, we'll come back to you in a second, Jonathan. John, did you want to, talk about the impact of COVID on the adoption of AI?
Well, I think COVID is obviously the new sexy thing. It just so happens to be a really big deal as well. I'm at the end of the day all for new tech. I just would like to remind the listeners that I think, this is my personal opinion, I think that very few technologies coming out of this interest will ultimately be adopted, and that's partly because we still exist in a highly regulated environment, from the FDA to reimbursement to medical practice. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, a lot of new tech simply won't be appropriate for use in the field, as it were, because it won't fit within current medical practice. Maybe some areas will be developed, that's fine. But I do think that COVID right now is a big driver, from what I've seen in the diagnostic space, in moving diagnostics out of the currently existing only in the clinical care space to moving it as well into home care and pushing it more into the telemedicine space as well. And these are fantastic opportunities that will come with huge data generation capabilities, which is where AI may fit in, of course. But we will still very much need to know how to deploy technologies and AI to help manage some of the issues that I've described, regulatory-wise, and previously, especially as we try to manage healthcare issues on a more global stage. So think lots of simultaneous data inputs. So for things as important as COVID diagnoses, technology is going to be critical here in helping to increase the testing footprint that's going to be meaningful in the diagnostic space. And just to sort of follow on what Brad was saying about the emergency use authorization, it's truly a unique experience for those of us in the diagnostic field. I've never seen this in my lifetime. I actually don't know if it's been done before. But the EUA really has allowed developers to quickly put out to market technologies that would have otherwise have taken a long time to validate. And I think the important lesson for all of us here is that a lot of these technologies are now being prevented from being used because precisely they weren't validated appropriately. And so I think at the end of the day, our development paradigm is going to remain intact. In other words, we have a process. It exists there for a reason. Obviously, we have unique circumstances, but we're beginning to fold them back into a more regulated environment.
Right. So for my benefit again, so this emergency use authorization was essentially a sort of a political, a legal tool that said you can develop technologies and deploy them. Is that right? Medical technologies and deploy them and use them on humans, and they bypass some of the standard regulatory checks?
So the idea behind the EUA was, in essence, a reliance on the test developers to assure the FDA and thereby the public that they were still continuing with the efficacy and safety studies that would be required for an eventual regulatory filing.
I see.
Shortcut the process and allow them to use the technology in the field sooner.
Right.
And declare that they were moving forward in the appropriate way. And unfortunately, as would be expected, a lot of the products that came out of the market were simply there because they could sell them, not because there was an interest in doing it the right way.
Right. So I guess there are two dangers. One, there must be just some proportion of well-intentioned products that naturally fall out of that process because the regulation process or that process discovers problems. But then on the other hand, the thing that you're talking about, which is that there could be bad actors out there who say, I've got a technology, I'm going to sell it. Oh yeah, I'm going through the regulatory process, but they really have no hope or intent of actually finishing it out.
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you. So Jonathan, the subject that we're on now, and you're the last person to speak on this, is just the fact that COVID-19 and the media, people are saying that it's really driving the adoption of AI and machine learning technologies. And do you feel that that's true in sort of a real and meaningful way, and why not?
Well, I think it definitely is a canvas where there's a lot of clay being thrown, against, or a lot of spaghetti thrown against the wall to see what sticks. I mean, there was an announcement early on that Watson was being used to design a new vaccine, and there's all these pretty 3D graphics of spike proteins that people haven't seen, everybody's becoming a virologist these days. And there's a lot of ML that's following that, whether it be in therapeutics, diagnostics, and so forth. I think the biggest challenge is, and we've seen it, where different politicians have proffered different medications as being possible ways of treating, COVID, is that we're still at a very, very primitive stage of understanding how to treat disease, and certainly to do it rapidly. And I think that the biggest beneficiary of COVID, it is a double-edged sword, as John was mentioning with the EU and the policies, is that there is, from a regulatory basis, a greater appetite to move things through, which leads to more capital, more venture capital that's able to be deployed, and frankly, some investor frothiness where people are throwing money into companies when they just announced they're not even used to hearing a preclinical study. What is that? And all of a sudden the stock goes up by 10x. So I think that, you know, machine learning is a beneficiary of that. I think the challenge is, and it's wild in the vaccine world, that we've seen with SARS-1, with Ebola, a lot of companies like spiked up, no pun intended with spike protein, but really shot up. No, nothing with a vaccine shot, just trying to be too funny. But the reality is that there's a lot of frothy interest in ML and so forth. And the big question is it a tortoise and hare phenomenon? Will these efforts stick? You know, like my first metaphor with the spaghetti on the wall. There's a lot of technology that's being thrown. There's a lot of AWS services that are being used and so forth and being consumed. But the big question is, you know, if it's the tortoise or the hare, if people are just going to burn through capital, they get to an adverse effect, and then their company just goes poof, and they liquidate their stock before that. You know, it's like that's the kind of situation that we're in right now. So it's more just, you know, who really is in it for the right reasons, for the long term, and is using the right kind of science and a science that can bifurcate, or if you hit, I mean, typically you hit a wall and then you figure out how you can use your learnings to do something better. And unfortunately, I think some are going to be doing that, and there's a lot more in the field than ever before, but others are just, you know, burning all their capital and going after a path, and, you know, they're just going to hit a wall. So I think it's a blessing and a curse. And the scary thing is, if a lot of companies fail, like the vaccine companies, the ones that are racing, and they might have less information in the race, but they're, you know, concerned about quarter by quarter revenue or bumping their stock up, their failures early on could really damage the entire field. So we're in a really sensitive place for both ML and life sciences right now in terms of expectation management and dealing with a lot of naive investors and politicians that really don't know what goes into these things and don't have the patience or the appetite to really see these things through fruition. So it's a plus and a minus.
So when just to ask about their failures, you said their failures early on could be damaging to the field. Are you suggesting that that the people who are throwing money at this don't understand how hard the problem is, and they're sort of over-promising and under-delivering, and people are going to get soured on the entire endeavor? Is that what you meant?
Yes, I mean, you know, the challenge is that you know, in an example, whether it's a vaccine or a diagnostic, a vaccine, it could go through fly through all these accelerated safeties, and then all of a sudden people start getting adverse reactions when they're exposed to the virus. That'll definitely sour people. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have these companies that are highly incentivized to come out with a vaccine rapidly. So you have sort of polarization of what the ambitions are, and the short and long-term sellers, the stocks, and all the rest of it. So we're kind of in a maelstrom of both opportunity, because, you know, there's so many companies. I mean, so few organizations can talk about anything but COVID. The media can't talk about anything but COVID. You know, there's obviously exceptions to that, but there's just so much stuff that's going on in this area that it's a huge danger that, let's say we don't come up with a vaccine, or, you know, then what will people think about science? I mean, and then the big issue is that all the parents that say they're the anti-vaxxers are saying, you know, I'm not going to bring in my kid. Hey, they might get COVID. I don't want to bring them in to get a vaccine. So our amount of vaccinations are rocketing up. So of lack of vaccination of kids. So we're in a really bizarre situation where so much money's been spent on science, and then there's this anti-science welling that's occurring too. And it's a polarization of our culture in so many ways, between the investment in ML and, you know, the possibilities of what could happen if things don't turn the way that they're being sold as turning.
I see. Right. I mean, it reminds me of, you know, when I was a younger man and went to grad school for artificial intelligence, we were just kind of coming out of the big AI winter, right? AI had gotten a tremendous amount of government funding. There were people who were saying that machines were going to be co-equal with human intelligence in a few years. And then everybody realized it's a really hard problem, and that just wasn't going to happen. And so the money all dried up. I mean, what you just described, I think, very clearly is it's a situation akin to that, except now there's a pandemic involved and there's politics involved, and so it's just significantly more complicated than it was, back when I was going to grad school. So, okay, all right, great. Well, again, thank you. Super interesting. What I'd like to do is, we've got about 5 minutes left, and if we could, there are a couple of questions that have been posted. So I'm going to try and sort of read and interpret a little bit, and then just throw it out to anyone who wants to answer. So the first one is, it says, do you expect these sort of AI-enabled devices to be flexible enough for testing in animals? Do you expect animal testing to be applied to help facilitate FDA approval for such devices? So, I guess we talked about zebrafish earlier, and I don't know if that's relevant here, but the standard path, I guess, is you do a lot of animal testing and then you move into humans. And it sounds like in some cases, maybe this question is sort of flipping it. It says, if you're using these devices in humans, and they're AI enabled and kind of tuned to humans and human physiology and human brains or whatever, do you expect that the animal path is going to be helpful? Does that make sense?
Well, there's definitely a path now with from a regulatory standpoint that there used to be extensive animal testing, but the big problem with animals right now for COVID, there's not a great animal model for COVID. So, that's a big issue. You're in a pandemic, and what do? You can't really test it because there's nothing that's reacting in the same way as humans, and that's disease by disease specific. So, everybody's looking at anything that could give signal, in terms of efficacy. That's why in the beginning I was talking about all these disparate systems, the antibody system, the cellular system. People are basically doing studies of these things with cell culture, not even animals, just human cells, and putting a little mixture in and seeing if it makes a difference. So I think that machine learning, data analytics are playing a big role right now, but they need to play a much bigger role, because what this has really taught us, this pandemic, one of the big lessons is, when you don't have an animal model, the human being is the animal model, and that's really not a great situation. So ML really has the opportunity to change that, because this will not be the last pandemic, unfortunately. You read a lot of papers, and there's going to be more and more epidemics and pandemics in the future, just because there's a bigger population. We're encroaching on more and more ecosystems with bats and other animals that have these infections, and so it's part of the human condition, and we need better models than human beings to test things.
Right. Sort of like what Brad was saying earlier about how he's using machine learning in his company to minimize the amount of invasiveness of some of these devices, right? And so when the human is the animal, you need to do all the work you can to make sure that you minimize the number of samples you need to come up with an effective treatment. Yeah. Any other comments on that one? There's another couple of questions.
Well, I'll just add that, we would, if we could, we would get away from animal models, because they're kind of like the only thing we have to rely on often, but they're not very good in many ways, right? And so there's a understandable but over dependence on it. We're starting to see certain situations where, not necessarily from AI, but just different kind of modeling in silico solutions that are starting to feed better kind of understanding of these things, that are equivalent to some of the efficacy elements associated with animal models, but unfortunately, that's a long ways to go. So we're kind of constrained. But in some cases, that's the point, is that they are applicable, and we can make translations between them. But more often than not, we're missing a good model.
Okay, I gotcha. So there's another question that seems to suggest that the medical community is not currently using X-rays or CT scans to identify COVID, whether you've got or don't have COVID. Is that true? Is the X-ray, or are people, radiologists, looking at X-rays and CT scans and making decisions about whether you've got it or not? Or are you using just standard, good old-fashioned stick a swab up your nose kind of tests?
Well, there are some examples of there are some challenges just using those types of tools for making diagnostics, because in the pandemic, the time between patients to these tools, so they can be these equipment, so they can be cleaned properly and disinfected, is actually a meaningful contribution to the test. So in some cases, there's been it's been a good way to diagnose things, my understanding, especially the CT. But it's cumbersome and difficult to do that because they didn't build the diagnostic suites around the situation.
Right. Okay. Yep. Good answer. So let's just do.
Well,
Yeah,
just
go
to
ahead.
add
Yeah,
a little bit to, I mean, with any disease, we're kind of at a war, right? And things change. And, you know, in the beginning, CTs had this ground glass appearance. Some investigators that do AI at Stanford built an AI engine to diagnose COVID using the ground glass appearance of the CT. But CTs are expensive, it's radiation exposure, and also, as Brad mentioned, you know, they're not made to be disinfected at this level at pace, and the cost and all the rest of it. So as the disease changes, and as things evolve, then you have these diagnostics that evolve. They weren't available at the very beginning. All we had was the CT. So now, you know, you can go to a CVS and you can stick something in your nose and do a test, and it can come back in a couple of days, and the hospitals have more rapid tests that use sequencing and so forth. So the nature of the tests change over time. That's a key consideration. And we need to go after things that are faster, less expensive, less invasive, and have less risk. And that's what we're seeing. You know, so the CT came out first because we had, you know, what's COVID? How do we know? We have no test kits.
Yeah.
And that was very effective. And now that's changed. So that's
Okay.
the evolution
So,
of medicine.
Yeah. So the question was sort of wondering if the fact that it was sort of machine learning driven or AI driven was the cause, but you're saying there are very practical issues of how rapidly can we pump people through these things, and how much do we know about the disease at any given time?
Yeah,
okay, so,
and $3 for a nasal swab or a blood versus a you know, $6,000 you know, study of a couple of patients. You know, which one do you pick?
Yeah, right.
Also, you know, we're looking at knowledge-based development in real time, as Dr. Merrill pointed out. We had no clue what to do at the beginning. This is all we had. And I think the hesitation to rely on some of these emergent observations is simply because we don't have comparative data yet. Now, a lot of this will be borne out at the end when we have all of the data sets and we can finally take a look with some, you know, comfort in time as to how CT scan compared to whatever other clinical comparator you want. So we are really seeing this in real time. It's truly extraordinary that we're getting this information to us provided so quickly. But this will be fascinating as we go forward.
And Tim, just to add one more flavor of this, you know, the airlines, if you catch a flight, they're using temperature of your forehead, right? I mean, is that a good signal using ML, temperature of your forehead for COVID? You know, if I put an ice cube on my head, I shouldn't tell everybody this. Can I board a plane with COVID? You know, so the point is that, you know, there's always a cost benefit, and there's how much signal is there. I mean, that's the basis of ML, sensitivity, specificity, how good is the data set? Sometimes we have to compromise and use really crappy tests because we have no other option. So that's the whole part of the spectrum here of tests and practicality and time. You can't, you know, so that's a big issue.
Right. The sort of pan and pandemic is getting us here, right? There's just so many people. Yeah. Okay. So if you guys can hang on for just 2 more minutes, maybe there's one last question I'd like to look at. So somebody's asking a 2-part question. One is, how does a startup deal with just tackling the complexity of a problem using AI? And then how do they deal with the talent shortage? So maybe can I take the talent shortage part of it? There are companies out there like Synaptiq, for example, that have people who are experts in applying machine learning and artificial intelligence across a broad array of industries to solve these problems. So one thing that you can do, and one thing we see a lot, is that people say, we've got a team that's working on our core business, but we can't find people to hire who do AI and ML because they're so hot these days. So one way you can think about extending your team is to collaborate with consulting companies that do that. You know, when you look for those companies, you need to make sure that they've got the experience, the people that are senior enough to tackle hard problems, and also, you know, in an ideal circumstance, could have some experience or some background in the domain where you're applying AI and machine learning technologies. But I mean, given that you guys are all in the startup space and you're tackling very hard medical problems with AI technologies, any thoughts on, like, how do you take that first bite of the apple, right? Like, how do you get going on solving a really complicated problem?
Well, from the diagnostic side, I'll say that we do 2 things. One is we are laser focused on some of the solutions that we're trying to tackle, the problems we're trying to tackle, and the solutions we're providing. And this may very well be through machine learning, and this is how, you know, we found ourselves on Synaptiq's doorstep, really, in trying to find partners who can do that for us. In the development side, when we're developing our technologies, we have to work with development partners that are also somewhat fluent in this language, or at least knowledgeable, to help us during the critical points of development, where if we stray too far initially, we're screwed in the end, because we can't make a pivot to get where we want to go. So planning is really crucial for us as well.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Well, for us, it's been a real focus on academic collaborators and partners who have a real narrow focus on these types of diseases and applying their craft to them. And I think that's been a real appeal to people who've been, who've studied neuroelectrophysiology and who've been some of the kind of early pioneers to apply AI to these problems. They want to keep tackling these problems, and we're trying to, I guess, continue that kind of like noble pursuit to actually see this and pushed out into the clinic, and that's motivating to a lot of people. So given kind of like the competition for talent, there's a lot of, I think, other problems that are very interesting, but for a narrow group of talented people, this is the problem they want to be solving, and so that's worked for us for now. But how that scales is yet to be seen, but so far so good.
Yeah, both of you sort of focused on focus, right? But in different terms, right? Like don't solve the whole problem, solve the interesting part of it. And then to the extent that you're solving an interesting part of the problem, maybe you can find people whose sort of passion is that thing, and they're not sort of generalists who are being sought after, but you might be able to find those people to help you grow your business. Yeah, okay. All right, well, thank you. So I appreciate you guys hanging out for a few extra minutes. A lot of fun. I really enjoyed the discussion. I learned a whole lot. And I'll just wrap up by saying for those of you who are in the audience, thank you for joining us. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are some documents attached to our channel. So there are project request forms if you're interested in that. There's an ebook out there on this topic that you can take a look at. And this recording is going to be available sometime soon if you'd like to share with other people. So John, Jonathan, Brad, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this discussion today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Okay.